Good morning, and thank you for joining me. My name is Funmilola Adeniyi. I will be speaking to you today on the constitutional right to food. Before I start my discussion, I'll first of all like to address something which I find that so many people walk up to me to say, I do understand the right to health, I do understand the right to education, I do understand perhaps the right to life, the right to freedom of movement, but I do not understand what the right to food is. How do you even begin to conceptualize food as a right? In response to this, I'd like to take us back to a speech by the late President Nelson Mandela during the ANC's Bill of Rights conference in 1991, where he stated, "A simple vote without food, shelter, and healthcare is to use first-generation rights as a smokescreen to obscure the deep underlying forces which dehumanizes people. We do not want freedom without bread, nor do we want bread without freedom." Many times also, I find that people ask me, why do we need a rights-based approach to food? Why can't we perhaps just say, let's ensure everybody has food security? Why do we need to entrench food security within a rights framework? And the response to that is quite straightforward. There are, of course, many reasons why, but I'd just like to pick on a few. First and foremost, like every other right, the right to food is a fundamental human right. It is indivisible and it is interdependent on other rights. There can be no right to health without the right to food. There can definitely be no right to life without the right to food. Other rights, such as the right to education, the right to work, will be greatly impaired where there is an abrogation of the right to food. Furthermore, the right to food creates an environment of accountability. It adds on to food security through an element of state obligation, whereby people are able to hold the state accountable for a denial of their right to food. A rights approach to food security considers and addresses the needs of vulnerable groups. It recognizes that there are people who are more vulnerable than others. There are people whose rights to food need special protective mechanisms for it to be fulfilled. What is the right to food? Over the years, many international and regional agreements and statements have provided for the right to food. I wouldn't be going into all today, but I'll just like to highlight specifically the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Now, the right to food has been provided for in this specific covenant, and it has been elaborated in General Comment 12 of the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, where the committee defined the right to food as when every man, woman, and child, alone or in community with others, has physical and economic access at all times to adequate food or to the means of its procurement. General Comment 12 imposes a threefold obligation on state parties in their realization of the right to food of everybody. First, state parties must respect the right to food. Second, they must protect the right to food. And third, they must fulfill the right to food. What are the key elements of the right to food? Once again, I refer to General Comment 12. In General Comment 12, the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights first stated that the right to food is inseparable from social justice. You cannot divorce the right to food from the whole compact of social justice. Secondly, it is subject to progressive realization. Given the differences in the economic wherewithal of nations, not every country is at a point whereby they can 100% guarantee the right to food. However, nations must show that they are working progressively towards realizing the right. However, there are certain aspects of the right to food that are immediately realizable for all, irrespective of the country's economic status. First, the freedom from hunger for all, and also the enjoyment of the right to food with non-discrimination. Another key element of the right to food is accessibility. Accessibility in this sense means both economic and physical accessibility. Availability is another key element of the right to food. Adequacy, another key element. Freedom from adverse substances, and the acceptability, that's the nutritive based values attached to food. So back home to South Africa, we must understand that South Africa is a signatory to many of the international and regional instruments I had earlier on referred to, and so they have commitments under those instruments. But over and beyond that, the right to food is constitutionally guaranteed in South Africa in 3 specific sections of the Constitution. First, Section 27(1)(b), which states that everyone has a right of access to sufficient food. Section 28(1)(c), which states that every child has a right to basic nutrition, and Section 35(2) subsection E, which states that every detained person and prisoner has a right to adequate nutrition. Like all other socioeconomic rights, the right to food in South Africa is justiciable. What this means is that where there is an allegation that the right to food of a person has been deprived, that person has the right to access the courts to level a complaint against either state parties or non-state actors who have led to this deprivation. In South Africa, lawmakers give effect to the right to food through certain legislation and policies. Permit me to say at this point that in South Africa, there is no specific dedicated legislation on the right to food. However, what we do have are legislations wherein you have different aspects covering the right to food of different vulnerable groups. For instance, the social security legislation, land legislation, healthcare legislation, and then policies such as the integrated food security strategy. Also, the courts over the years have shown their willingness to enforce social claims. Unfortunately, until quite recently, we've not had a specific case in South Africa which has been couched from a right to food framework. Also, Chapter 9 institutions in the course of their investigations have also over the years delved into issues around the right to food. So, having said that, what has been the reality in the realization of the right to food prior to COVID-19? I'd like to look at it in terms of aspirations versus reality. Legislation and policies have great aspirations for the fulfillment of the right to food in South Africa. However, the reality shows that almost up to 21.3% of households in South Africa still have inadequate access or severely inadequate access to food. South Africa still sits with a very great problem of child stunting of children below the age of 5, with no significant improvements over the last 10 years. The absence of a framework law on the right to food 26 years after democracy continues to pose a challenge for the fulfillment of the right to food. Poor implementation of policies is also another issue. Disjointed intergovernmental coordination of policies and the lack of the central accountability framework taking charge of the right to food continues to pose issues on the fulfillment of the right to food in South Africa. Like I had mentioned earlier, there have been very few attempts to litigate the right to food specifically in South Africa. In fact, all that has come thus far until about June of this year has been other cases in which you would clearly see a right to food framework, but they were framed from other perspectives, maybe a contestation over legislation, or perhaps a contestation over the right to work and things like that. Also, I'd like to, unfortunately, there's been civil society apathy on the right to food campaign in South Africa. South Africa has a very, very vibrant civil society network, but you find the greatest campaigns on issues around the right to housing, the right to health, probably even the right to water. The right to food it's been silence, mostly. And so comes COVID-19, and juxtaposing that with the realities of the right to food and what people have faced, I doubt it's news to anyone that over the past couple of months, the greatest challenge to many families in South Africa has been meeting financial obligations. But over and above meeting financial obligations, meeting the most basic needs, such as food, has proven to be a challenge. COVID-19 has exposed the disjuncture between policy and implementation because of the absence of a framework legislation and the impact of the lack of coordination of policies across departments, national departments. There's been that gap on who or what departments are responsible for ensuring the right to food of everybody, and not just of everybody, specifically of vulnerable groups in the light of COVID-19. And so, for instance, with regards to the delay or the disjuncture between policy and implementation, we've seen, for instance, and so with regards to the disjuncture between policy and implementation, we've seen, for instance, over the last few months, how the delay in the renewal of tenders has adversely affected the implementation of the social relief of distress grants in a couple of provinces, whereby several vulnerable people have been unable to access the food parcels that come, or the food vouchers that come through the social relief of distress grant. Again, under COVID-19, we've seen particularly vulnerable groups falling through the cracks. Whilst on the one hand, we commend the 350 rand grant that has been granted to every needy person or those who have been identified as vulnerable, of course, that amount continues to remain grossly insufficient, specifically when you take into account how much the average food basket currently costs. Furthermore, there's been a lot of vulnerability heightened with regards to children who used to rely on the National School Nutrition Program, not having access to that program because schools are closed. And so there's heightened vulnerability for many, many, many. Also, I would like to say on a positive note, however, we've seen a more heightened and active role for many Chapter 9 institutions, specifically the South African Human Rights Commission, with regard to their intervention on Cape Town refugees and access to the open spaces in town to be able to sell. Also with regards to their intervention on school nutrition program. And what I would say has probably been the biggest win for the Right to Food campaign since the beginning of COVID-19 is probably what may be officially regarded as the first right to food framed case in the country, wherein education equality together with the school governing boards of 2 schools in Limpopo have brought a case before the High Court in Pretoria, trying to compel the Department of Basic Education to extend the National School Nutrition Program to all learners, irrespective of whether or not they are yet to resume. Of course, this also touches on about 6 provinces currently, because the Western Cape has made the guarantees that it will continue to feed its learners whether or not schools are opened or closed. And so in conclusion, I must say that there remains opportunities for the realization of the right to food in South Africa. Civil society campaign must continue to file test cases on the right to food. And I'd like to draw attention to the recent concluding observations and recommendations of the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights to the initial report of South Africa submitted in 2018. And with regards to the right to food, the committee noted a couple of things. First, that South Africa needed to increase the child support grant up to the level of the food poverty line, ensure that all eligible children benefit from the grant, expedite the adoption of social assistance amendments bill, and I think this is the note on which I like to close, adopts a framework legislation protecting the right to adequate food and nutrition for all in South Africa. One of the key elements on the realization of the right to food, as recognized under both international and regional instruments, is legislative measures. Until South Africa takes seriously the creation of right to food specific legislation, then we will continue to grapple with the gaps in the realization of the right to food. Thank you. So, moving on to what the realities of the right to food are in South Africa as exposed by COVID-19. I think one of the first things I like to state is that COVID-19 has exposed the disjuncture between policy and implementation. There have been a lot of issues over the last couple of months with SASSA and the renewal of tenders vis-a-vis the social relief of distress grants and the vendors there who were responsible for delivering food parcels. And all of those delays continue to attest to the fact that there's a problem with the coordination of policy and the implementation of policy on ground. Secondly, the absence of a framework legislation on the right to food in South Africa and how this has impacted greatly on the coordination between policies and the coordination between national departments as it concerns the right to food in South Africa has been laid bare under COVID-19. We've had a lot of issues, for instance, on the issues around school nutrition program, whereby the schools have claimed that because the school nutrition program is a conditional grant from Treasury, they are unable to continue with the program and then under the lockdown. And then in that case, the social development department should continue to feed kids. And so you've had a lot of that coming to the fore in not being able to pinpoint who is responsible for what. Specifically, COVID-19 has revealed how particularly vulnerable groups fall through the cracks, where there is an absence of legislation and of coordination nationally and even provincially. I'd like to allude to also on this to the insufficiency of the 350 Rand grant. Great as much as that provision has been, when you juxtapose that with the average price of the basic food basket, it remains grossly insufficient to even meet the most basic of needs, which is food. On the positive side, I think there's been a heightened role for a lot of Chapter 9 institutions with regards to the right to food, specifically the South African Human Rights Commission, who we've seen has taken a lead role over the last couple of months in ensuring that people's right to food, or all of those things which contribute to the right to food, such as people being able to access certain spaces, informal traders being able to access certain spaces to be able to sell their goods in furtherance of their right to an adequate standard of living, and by implication their right to food is not hampered upon by city or municipality bylaws. And then also, I think we might be having what we could officially term the first right to food framed case in the country coming up. In about June, equality education, along with the school governing boards of 2 schools in Limpopo, brought a case before the High Court of Pretoria to compel the Department of Basic Education to extend the National School Nutrition Program to all learners, irrespective of whether or not they had resumed. In conclusion, there continues to remain opportunities for the realization of the right to food in South Africa. Juxtaposing that with COVID-19, I see in the nearest future a likelihood for many right to food related cases, because if there has been one pandemic which has to a very large extent revealed the dehumanizing conditions in which many people live, such that the most basic thing, food, they are unable to afford, it's been COVID-19. And I think that's beginning to sensitize so many people. It's also beginning to sensitize a lot of civil society organizations towards taking up the cause of the right to food, and towards actually beginning to challenge many of government's policies and even the lack of legislation on the right to food. Also, I question whether what I'll term the notorious basic income grant has come to stay. And yes, the 350 Rand grant from SASSA has not been couched as a basic income grant, but perhaps this is the beginning of that conversation on why the basic income grant is a necessity in the context of South Africa and the gross inequality and the poverty that continues to plague the majority of the population. Lastly, I'd just like to draw our attention to the recent concluding observations of the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in response to South Africa's initial report filed in 2018. And while most of the recommendations of on the right to food, which the committee had, dwelt on children and ensuring the right to food of children, the committee also flagged off the need for South Africa to adopt a framework legislation to protect the right to adequate food and nutrition in South Africa. I do not think that we can, as a nation, begin to talk about the fulfillment of the right to food for all in South Africa, where that gap continues to exist 26 years after democracy. Thank you.